All right, good afternoon, everyone. We wanted to follow up Jacob's presentation with a panel discussion on the changing shape of energy infrastructure. We know that the industry, as we could tell today, is going through quite a change. Before we get started, I just want to introduce our panelists. First up is Noureen Faizee, a Global Director of Strategy and Growth, Hydrogen at Worley. In this capacity, she is responsible for exploring opportunities to transform our energy sector within the growing hydrogen marketplace. Prior to this role, she led strategy development for the upstream and midstream oil and gas sector in Worley. She has an MS in chemical engineering from the University of Toledo, Ohio. We also have Luiz Soriano, who is a sales and business development manager at Siemens Energy. Luiz has more than 20 years of experience in the energy industry. For the last 10 years, he has held leadership roles in manufacturing, quality proposals, and sales. Luiz supports the energy transition and decarbonization goals by developing compression solutions for various applications across the hydrogen and CO2 value chain. Finally, we have Patrick McCalley. Patrick is Sales and Product Manager, Hydrogen Economy Americas at NEA Group, USA. Patrick works with NEA experts to translate market needs into timely product offerings. He has a BS in physics from Penn State University and more than 20 years of experience with high-pressure compression and hydrogen system design. We are very fortunate to have their insights today. I wanted to lead off with a few questions that we have prepared in advance, but we invite you to participate in questions of your own as the discussion progresses. First of all, for Noureen, where is the current state of the hydrogen industry, and what is the future outlook?
First of all, thank you, Jack, for this opportunity. Just as an introduction, again, some of you may already know who we are as a company, but for those who don't know, Worley is a global leader in providing engineering and consulting services across the energy, chemicals, and resources sectors. We have been a predominantly oil and gas-based business in the past, but our ambition now is to achieve more than 75% of our revenue coming from sustainability-related services, and that too by 2026. So as a leading provider of services in the energy space, I think we have a key role in shaping and supporting the transition. And we have a portfolio of more than like 3,000 projects under the energy transition umbrella, and quite a large number of projects in the hydrogen space as well. So in terms of the current and future outlooks, I've used this line quite a lot in my previous discussions, but I'm going to use it one more time. And that is like, recently someone asked me where I'm based out of, and I said inadvertently that I live in hydrogen. I'm based out of Houston, but the number of times I use the word hydrogen in my daily conversations is, you get the picture, right? So hydrogen is experiencing unprecedented attention and momentum over the past few years. There was a question around, whether or not hydrogen would take off. It's already happening right now. And so the real question now is, how soon would we see the transition happen and at what scale? And so we are seeing hundreds of projects being proposed and being developed every day by companies across the world. But the reality is that less than 10% of those projects are actually reaching the financial investment decision. In fact, the IEA quotes only around 2%. There's another stats from McKinsey that say it's around like 8 or 9%. So that is quite low, and we need to be able to accelerate that at a much higher level to meet our net zero goals. And there are quite a few challenges that we will discuss later on during our conversation, but one of the biggest challenges that projects are facing to reach FID is obviously the cost. Because at the end of the day, the success and failure of all these new energy sources, new technologies would depend on the economics of the project. But we don't, have the luxury to wait until those technologies mature and the infrastructure gets built and all of that, because it took years for renewable energies like solar and wind to be cost competitive with fossil fuels. but we don't have that time frame for hydrogen to be able to be at cost parity with natural gas. So the governments are, have been like really supportive in launching various initiatives such as the Inflation Reduction Act, the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program, the DOE hydrogen hubs. So the time is now to take advantage of that opportunity and to be able to make those investments in innovation and projects and really accelerate the deployment of hydrogen at the scale that we really want to see. And just earlier this month, the full applications for the DOE hydrogen hubs were submitted, and the plan is to select at least 4 to 6 hubs for funding the hydrogen hubs for $8 to $9 billion this year. So that's going to be like a massive milestone to kickstart the hydrogen economy here in the US. And there's plenty of other initiatives that are happening across companies from a public and private standpoint, which we will get to later on in the discussion.
Adding to that, what are some of the use cases you're seeing for compression in hydrogen applications? So hydrogen needs like buy-in from every part of the value chain, right? And the hydrogen value chain can also be divided in a similar fashion as the oil and gas, where upstream is hydrogen production, midstream would be hydrogen storage and transportation, and the downstream could be distribution and the end users. And hydrogen, compressors are needed in every part of that value chain, like from in the production, in the storage, and fuel cells for fueling stations, in the transportation sector, chemical processing, refining, and the requirements would be different for different applications. Luiz, one of the questions we came up with is what are the key demand drivers for hydrogen compressors in the market now?
Sure, Jack. Can you guys hear me okay? So to build on what Noureen said, so across the entire hydrogen value chain, there is a strong need for compression, right? So I was telling a friend the other day that all these projects we see being announced these days, they have two things in common. One is hydrogen, and the second, they all need compressors. So really, we at Siemens Energy, we are focused on large-scale industrial projects. So that's the part of the value chain that we are serving these days. So think about the clean hydrogen production plants, blue or gray, or hydrogen liquefaction plants or pipelines for the transportation market and mobility market, or storage applications, underground storage for power generation or pipeline buffers. So that part of the value chain, we're seeing an increased number of projects since the last 1 to 2 years. But what Noureen was saying, a lot of those projects are still budgetary proposals or FEED studies or conceptual designs. So that's the current state of the market that we are seeing in our company. However, we are seeing many projects moving to FID and getting approval from the board and moving to a procurement phase, and projects actually ordering compressors on all those markets. So I think it's really picking up and gaining momentum on the recent months, and I think the trend will continue as we advance and we have more clarity on the kind of incentives that the government is providing and how the financial of these projects will work with the incentives like the production tax credit. We'll see more projects being deployed in our region. So as was mentioned this morning, we really don't know for sure. Everybody has its own crystal ball, but all our indicators point to a growth on the demand for hydrogen compressors, and we are preparing to meet this demand in coming years.
Are you seeing new applications, new demand for hydrogen compressors?
Yes. So to build on that, hydrogen, and I like to say that, so hydrogen compression is not necessarily new for our industry, right? Companies like Siemens Energy, Siemens, Howden, we are making hydrogen compressors for decades now. So I can give you a few examples. For example, hydrogen booster compressors for liquefaction plants, or hydrogen pipeline compressors for pipelines, or hydrogen injection compressors. Those are well-known applications for the industry with established designs and field-tested solutions, so nothing really new on those applications for us. Another good example I like to mention is related to the boom in the ammonia market. If you follow the news every week, there's a new large ammonia project being announced in the US. Those large-scale ammonia projects, they will be served with centrifugal compressors, axial compressors, just because of the flows. Now, there are also some different ammonia projects, small-scale ammonia projects, where we have a unique solution that was what we call a multi-service reciprocating compressor, where you can have 3 or 4 services on the same crankcase. Those machines are like 7, 8, 9 throws. 5,000 horsepower and above. So this is a solution that was actually developed in the 70s when we had like a similar ammonia boom market in the ammonia market in the US. And some of these compressors are still up and running. So now back 50 years in the future, we are now seeing the same ammonia, small scale ammonia projects where we can apply that very same solution very effectively. So again, nothing new for the industry. What is changing though, my opinion, is our clients finding new end uses for this hydrogen, for example, on fuel cells or on storage. And those end users are driving new requirements for the existing technology, like, for example, oil contamination limits, for example.
So you talked a little bit about new clients, customers. Now, the broader topic that we're talking about is the energy transition. Are you seeing different customers coming to you now?
Yes. Almost every day we have a new client coming to us, and we are learning a lot from them. Just to give like some examples to illustrate, we are talking a lot with electricity companies today. They come to us and say, hey, I want to build like a 500 megawatts plant. And we ask them to translate to tons per day or pounds per hour, because being a compressor guy, he want to talk about mass flow. So those are new companies for us looking to get into the hydrogen business, to sell the hydrogen as sell molecules instead of electrons. Interesting enough, we're seeing some very well-known clients from the oil and gas industry that they're setting new business models where they want to sell the hydrogen as a final product instead of using hydrogen as a consumable for their processes. So these clients, they know how to compress hydrogen just like we know, but they are looking at different business models. That's also very common these days. And the third type of company is to what Noureen said regarding the hydrogen hubs. All that money that's available in the government, that's bringing a lot of new players into this market, like hydrogen developers and companies looking to develop projects to get access to that DOE funding. They are also reaching out to OEMs like us to support on those proposals. So yeah, quite different. Like 5 years ago, we would be sitting here and not talking about any of that.
Patrick, how about you? What kind of interest are you seeing in hydrogen in the market?
Yeah, so Newman & Esser, similar to Siemens Energy, is an OEM of reciprocating compressors. One of the things we also have is our Hofer line of diaphragm compressors. So those are used in transportation at the very high pressures that we're talking about, up to 1,000 bar. So we're seeing a ton of interest in that, and that's really nothing new. As Luiz mentioned, hydrogen has been around. It's been a core part of what we do for the last decades. It's probably about 75% of all of our compressors normally. So the interest driven by the IRA has really changed, I would say, the types of projects we're seeing. Like Luiz mentioned, very large-scale electrolysis plants, hundreds of megawatts. 5 years ago, 2 years ago, that everything was at a much smaller scale. So really see this growth and this investment, through the IRA as as driving larger scale projects.
Noureen, what are you seeing from the IRA? Is there a lot of interest in that? Is that driving a lot of demand?
Absolutely. I think the IRA has been like one of the largest investments, funding available here in the US. Actually, not just in the US, but probably the largest in terms of incentives across the world. And, every time I read it, it's just so complex and so massive. It's like thousands of pages long, and I come across something new that I learn every day each time I read it. But to summarize, I would say there are like two key provisions that subsidize clean hydrogen production. One is the Section 45V, which is the Clean Hydrogen Production Tax Credit, where suppliers are eligible to take an advantage of maximum of $3 per kilogram of hydrogen produced. And the credits are purely based on the overall life cycle emissions of that project. So it's not specific to one color, if it's blue or green or pink, but it's really dependent on the emissions intensity. And clean hydrogen in this case qualifies as hydrogen that has a carbon emissions intensity of 4 kilograms of CO2, of less than 4 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. And the other significant tax credit available for hydrogen is the 45Q tax credit, which is the carbon capture tax credits. So previously, carbon capture tax credits were existent even prior to IRA, but then the amount of credit has substantially increased. So previously it was like $50 per ton of CO2 sequestered, and now it has like increased to $85 per ton of CO2 sequestered. The other advantage of IRA is also that you can combine some of the tax credits. You cannot combine 45V and 45Q, but you can combine either of those tax credits if you are using renewable electricity from wind or power, solar or nuclear sources. So there's a lot of, you're just not limited to that $3 per kilogram, but there are various incentives within the IRA that you can take advantage of. Apart from that, there are also other incentives, which is the investment tax credits for energy storage, which includes hydrogen. There's clean vehicle tax credits for vehicles using hydrogen, and then there's alternative fuel credits for alternative fueling stations, in which case, there will be a strong interest in building out the hydrogen infrastructure in the transportation sector. So there's also like some incentives that are driving the demand right now. But there's another significant program within the IRA. I mean, everybody talks about tax credits within the IRA, but then there is another program called as the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program, the EIR program, where the Department of Energy Loans Program Office is authorized to give up to $250 billion in low-cost debt to either replace aging energy infrastructure or to build new energy infrastructure. So essentially, like most of the projects that we are talking about today, I mean, would qualify for that loan program, and it's the largest expansion in the loan program's office history. Because if you see at the previous numbers, I think over the last 10 years, they've probably issued like $35 billion cumulative in funding, and now we're talking about like almost 10 times higher, right? So that's a huge program that we could all take advantage of when we are, working on technological innovations to reduce the cost down, to create, manufacturing capacity at scale, etc. But one thing to note here is that this program expires in September 2026, so there is a limited window of opportunity for participants who might be interested.
Okay. Well, one thing we've learned today, there's obviously a lot of research going on, and there's a lot more research that needs to be done. How soon do you think this will be accomplished? How long before we get to a hydrogen economy?
I think the DOE hubs would really, help in kickstarting that hydrogen economy, right? So we are targeting by the end of this year when the DOE would announce those 4 to 6 hubs. So once those hubs like really get started, I think it would make way for some of the other projects to take off. So.
Well, one thing also is that green hydrogen is the holy grail. Everyone wants green hydrogen, but we've got blue, we've got gray. Is the future green, or is it some other mix of colors?
So I don't know if it's going to be green or blue, but I know for sure that it has to be clean, right? So the emphasis, even within the IRA, is on clean hydrogen production. But the fact here, we need to understand it's like more than 99% of the hydrogen that is produced in the US comes from fossil fuels, out of which 95% is from natural gas. So that is obviously the low-hanging fruit where, blue hydrogen production, I mean, the US would be well placed to make blue hydrogen, not only because of, cheap and significantly available natural gas, but US also has like significant CO2 storage capacity. And the deployment of other technologies is a little less advanced, like Jacob was mentioning about pyrolysis, the green hydrogen from electrolysis. They're all there, but the reality is that the market is still very nascent, and the infrastructure challenges associated with scale-up of those technologies is quite underappreciated today. Lack of manufacturing at scale, like cost, reliability, and availability in the supply base across the entire value chain. I mean, we don't get into those details as much. So the most logical approach would be to focus on that low-hanging fruit, which is the blue hydrogen production, because the infrastructure is already there that we can utilize. The end-use markets are already there that are using gray hydrogen today. So start off by building a base there, and then wait for the emergence of green hydrogen, where it becomes a predominant approach in the coming years, or maybe some other new technology that we're not even talking about today. So,
okay, thank you. Patrick, for your company, how are hydrogen projects different than traditional oil and gas projects?
Yeah, so some of the projects that we see are very similar to traditional oil and gas, but others are quite different. And like Luiz mentioned, there's a lot of new customers into the looking to do hydrogen projects. A traditional oil and gas project would have an application that was very well known, been doing it for decades. An engineering company or a customer would have a data sheet with all the right parameters you need to size your compressor and create that offering. What we're seeing in the hydrogen space is customers are more looking for solutions. So we have this concept, we need to get, X amount of pressure to X amount of hydrogen to this pressure. What do you guys have for that? So, one of the things we do is we have a variety of compression technologies available to us with the reciprocating compressors, the diaphragm compressors, and also a hydraulic booster type compressor. So really being able to take a customer's needs and see what technologies fit best is something that's a little different and actually pretty exciting in the hydrogen industry.
So it's sort of more like an educational, kind of a communication that way.
Absolutely. A lot of startups in the hydrogen space have very little previous knowledge with rotating equipment. So it's a lot of education that we're doing. Sometimes you say, go buy the 618 manual, take a read, look in the back, But it's a cool opportunity. One of the things at Newman and Esser that we've seen is, we want to expand along the hydrogen value chain. So Newman and Esser, it's close to 200 years old. It's fourth generation family owned. Sustainability is a core value. So, about a decade ago, we started looking at how can we help this transition to the hydrogen economy, and we started adding products like electrolyzers, also doing more integration of our compressors, for that application. So this would eventually lead to, full hydrogen filling stations, in combination of the different products.
Speaking of filling stations, where do you see hydrogen in the transportation market?
Right. So currently, right now, there's about 54 hydrogen filling stations open retail in California. Another 120 or so are in development. It's developing, I think, maybe a little slower than we had thought it would have. And some of that is, the cost of hydrogen. It's $20 a kilogram at the pump in California, and that's not really, going to get to cost parity. One of the hopes I have is that this IRA and the generation of hydrogen at scale, right, is going to help, for the traditional industries, the blue ammonia, for steel, for carbon capture, but also then be able to have different off-takers for transportation.
Okay. Luiz, how is this technology deployed? What is different and what has changed?
Yeah, so Jack, the technology fundamentals haven't changed much over the last decades. So we believe the demand for compression in the value chain will be addressed. The bulk of the demand will be addressed by positive displacement machines. So reciprocating compressors, screw compressors, diaphragm compressors. Just based on a combination of high efficiency, those machines perform very well on low molecular weight applications like hydrogen and at a competitive cost. So they are really a good choice for the majority of the energy transition projects that we are seeing. And the right technology is just going to depend on your pressure sets, your process conditions, your flow, and things like that. But they are all great choices within the positive displacement family of compressors. Specific about the reciprocating compressors, that the product that I am more familiar with, this type of compressor have a very good turn down capability, which is a super important requirement for clean hydrogen production plants. I should say green hydrogen production plants, because most of these green hydrogen production plants, they have intermittent renewable energy supply, right? So some of these clients, they want to generate hydrogen only, or they can generate hydrogen when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing, and it's not a constant supply production of hydrogen, as I am learning. So they need that turn down capability, and the reciprocating compressor has various tools that allow you get turn downs as low as 20-15% while keeping the efficiency constant, and that's a very important feature that technology can provide. And as the machine gets bigger, it gets more and more important. And if you're planning to operate at partial load for extended periods of time, so that's a nice feature of the reciprocating compressors. So with that being said, we see some opportunity for centrifugal compressors. We talked a lot about pipelines. Centrifugal compressors, they have, it's challenging to compress hydrogen just because the way they work, converting kinetic energy into potential energy, you don't have enough mass, so you have to make up for that low mass with additional velocity. And that becomes challenging because they're so much faster. You can run a centrifugal compressor. But we believe for some unique applications like pipelines, we see centrifugal compressors being deployed, just based also on the limitation of the reciprocating compressor in terms of size. As this project scale up, you are seeing like clients coming to you, you size the compressor, and then you need like 5 or 6 very large reciprocating compressors, and then you start to think, is that feasible from a commercial perspective, right? Technically it's always feasible, but sometimes commercially is not the best solution for the project. That's when you start thinking about a centrifugal compressor for hydrogen, which is something, back to what I was saying before, is a well-known application. We have like hydrogen centrifugal compressors on offshore applications for many years now. And we may see this technology being deployed on hydrogen pipelines in the future.
Okay. But with the hydrogen compressors, do they have to start and stop a lot? And is that difficult for them? Is that hard on them?
Yeah, so That's also something different that is coming to us through the energy transition. So if you think about those reciprocating compressors on a refinery, for example, they were designed to operate uninterrupted for years, right? That's what API 618 requires. And that's what the compressors were designed for. Now, precisely because of that reason I was saying about the intermittent availability of energy for those hydrogen production plants, you have these clients coming to us say, hey, I want to operate at 15% capacity and I want to start and stop the compressor every day. So that's something different. And we looked into that and we discussed it internally. And our conclusion is that these compressors built for refineries, they can be deployed on a hydrogen production plant, for example, but you have to have some special considerations. For example, the motor needs to be sized and designed for the same frequency of starts and stops. That's very important. You need to have constant power supply for auxiliary systems like your lube oil console, jacket water console. They need to be running constantly. You have to run cooling water through the cylinder jackets, especially if you have wet hydrogen. You don't want that water condensating inside your cylinder bores. That's very important. You also need to think about blowdown procedures. If you want to start and stop the machine every day, you don't want to vent that product every day because you're basically wasting power. So those are the discussions, you're wasting money. So those are the discussions that we are having with our clients every day. But the answer is yes, they can be started and stopped every day.
I think this was touched on earlier this morning, but are there certain challenges with working with non-lubricated compression?
Yes, so many challenges and that were addressed by the colleagues from Cook in the morning. But to build on that, this is also another trend associated with the energy transition. 5 years ago, the non-lubricated reciprocating compressors, they were the exception. So I used to work on proposals for those machines, and 1, 2 out of 10 proposals were non-lube. And on the last 2 years, that quickly became the standard. You can go to a conversation with a client, the first question that comes up is, can you do non-lube? And we can, but there are challenges with that compressor, mainly associated with the wear rate of piston rings and rider bands, and that's what was addressed by the colleagues from Cook. And the reason is that the wear rate of those components will ultimately define the uptime of your compressor. And that's very important for hydrogen production plants because they need to make as much money as they can keeping the plant running. So we are seeing clients coming to us where they are actually defining the uptime of the production plant based on the uptime of the compressor because they believe that's the equipment that will require more maintenance at their facility. So this is a very, very sensitive and important topic for clients today. And I think every OEM is developing, together with suppliers like Cook and others, solutions for non-lubricated compressors. So as an OEM, there are some tools available to minimize the wear rate on a non-lubricated compressor. Some of the things that we can do is slow the machine down. We can reduce the piston speed. That was also presented by the colleagues. By reducing the piston speed, you will reduce that wear rate. But on the opposite side, your compressor will get bigger and you'll get more expensive. So there's a balance there. The other things you can do, you can minimize the piston weight. If you minimize that piston weight, you will reduce the loads on the bearing, on the bands and rings. That will minimize wear. And obviously you can work with suppliers to define special materials of construction and come up with special designs. So there's everything that we are working on at the moment to address this demand. Today in our portfolio, we can offer non-lubricated compressors up to 3,000 pounds discharge pressure, which addresses the majority of the applications that we are seeing in the market. Again, on that upper side of the value chain, as it progresses down, then the flows start to get low and the pressure is higher, that you have to revert to a different compressor technology, and then you just call Patrick. You take care of it.
Patrick, we talked about this a little bit, but with the price of hydrogen as it is, Where or how do you see the transportation market developing? Either heavy duty or light duty?
Right, so there's a ton of interest right now for heavy duty. It's still kind of in the early stages, but where it makes a lot of sense, and hydrogen makes a lot of sense, will be compared to electrification of battery electric vehicles. So right now, at least my thinking of it is electrify what we can, really, right? Because it's a lot more efficient. Up to 95% of the energy from renewables go into an electric battery, drive your car, that's great. That's a lot harder to do with a heavy-duty truck or a Class 8 truck because, for one, the weight of the batteries is an issue, will then eat into the payload, right? So that's one area where, and the distance that is needed to go would be less with batteries. So we really see heavy-duty stations and heavy-duty trucking as a very bright spot for hydrogen. That, along with trains, maritime, and even planes. So those areas really make a lot of sense. Just some of the graphics earlier for even further distance transportation. You have hydrogen carriers such as ammonia, which can be used. And so that is currently in development. I think a lot of the heavy-duty vehicles right now are at 350 bar. We do see that going up to 700 bar to get the further range. There's a lot of programs going on where this filling profiles are being developed because that's not developed yet. And then finally, there's tremendous interest growing for liquefaction of hydrogen as maybe a longer-term solution there. So potentially putting liquid directly into the vehicles and using that for even further range.
Well, across the discussions we've had today, there's sort of a chicken and egg situation. You have to have the hydrogen to have the product. You have to have the product to use the hydrogen. Are you seeing a lot of interest in companies that want to have fueling stations across the country, or is it sort of specific markets? Or
yeah, so a lot of the heavy-duty truck OEMs are basically providing the hydrogen as a service, right? So they're co-developing the hydrogen infrastructure along with the trucks. And that is really, the first examples will kind of be like back to base, fixed delivery routes, or buses, is another big section for those in California and elsewhere across the country. Also receiving a lot of funding from the government projects and making that possible.
okay, yeah, so something that's on a fixed route that goes
Right.
back to the same place every day. I think you talked a little bit about this, but what other kind of advantages or disadvantages does hydrogen have over electric?
Yeah, so again, mostly just the weight, but also the fueling experience, right? So filling up a vehicle, truck, car, or bus with hydrogen feels just like it does at the pump with gasoline or diesel. It fills in relatively, 5 to 10 minutes, and you're on the road again.
So, for your company, are you seeing more interest in blue or green hydrogen production at this point?
Well, kind of like Noureen mentioned, we're seeing a lot of both, but some of the blue hydrogen projects are a little closer to funding.
Okay.
And then as Luiz mentioned, some very large-scale green projects, seeing those as well. People that are solar developers, looking to do hundreds of megawatts of electrolysis, which actually really isn't a new thing, especially for alkaline electrolysis, which has been around for a very long time.
Mm-hmm. What about carbon capture?
Carbon capture is something we're running into a lot as well. A lot of times it goes hand in hand with the blue hydrogen projects. There's some interesting projects that we're involved in, and some of those are on electrofuels. So electrofuels is where you would take the carbon that you've captured, you combine it with green hydrogen, and create a electrofuel, a liquid fuel that will be used for aviation for other purposes.
Okay. Now, Luiz, what is the critical information necessary to design a hydrogen compressor?
Well, Jack, obviously pressures, temperatures, and flows. Without that information, you really can't size a compressor. But there are many other considerations too. So the exact gas composition that's important for the OEM to calculate the exact molecular weight. That's important to get you an accurate cylinder sizes. If your hydrogen is dry or wet, has a major impact on the compressor selection, because if you have water, the first stage cylinder, that mass flow need to account for that water, so your first stage cylinders will get much bigger, and then they will progressively get smaller as water is condensated and removed throughout the compression stages. Another very important thing, if you have cooling water available at site, that will define what kind of interstage cooler you have, and that will define your interstage temperatures. That will also have a significant impact on the compressor selection. If you have any oil contamination limit that was discussed many times today, that's also important for the OEM to know. And things like spare philosophy. So on these early projects that we are engaging with clients today, that's also a very interesting discussion. What kind of redundancy you need at your plant? Do you need like a 1 by 100%, 2 by 100%, 3 by 50%? Those are things that you have to think about on the early stages of your project. Again, it's going to come down to the reliability and uptime, not on the equipment only, but of the complete plant. It will come at a cost, but that's an interesting discussion to have. So basically, the more information you give to the OEM, the better the solution you get. And the earlier you engage your OEM, the better, because that's when you have more flexibility on your project to accommodate different solutions, right? So that's all I can think about.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Noureen, we talked about the IRA, but what are some of the other, I guess, programs or emphasis that the DOE has to bring about hydrogen in our economy?
So the DOE had actually published their strategy or their roadmap document last year, and basically it has emphasis on 3 key areas. The first one is to basically target strategic high impact users of hydrogen as the end users. The second one is to lower the cost of hydrogen production. They have a program called the DOE Hydrogen Shorts program, where the target is to reduce the cost of hydrogen production to $2 per kilogram by 2026 and to $1 per kilogram by 2031. And this is all without subsidies. And the final focus for DOE is to basically select at least 4 hubs by the end of this year to really, take, let the hydrogen projects take off from the ground.
For everyone, last question. We've heard a lot today about the challenges. There's a lot of research, like I said, going on, but there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered. From each of your own perspectives, what needs to be solved to get this to scale? Who wants to start?
I can go first. There's like number of challenges that we can talk about, right? Like cost and scale and technology, etc. But I would just want to keep it very broad. The challenge of climate change is quite enormous, and if the governments and the communities and companies don't share common goals, I feel like the social challenge of decarbonization would be much greater than the technical and economical challenge. And so it's important that we have an immense amount of collaboration across both public and private sectors, and to be able to share lessons learned, to be able to share opportunities, IP, and therefore be able to build and replicate the infrastructure much faster and at much scale. Where everybody wins, because if we don't do that, then we're going to be quite far ways from reaching our net zero goals, And just one example I want to give is, for collaboration is the recent rollout of COVID-19 vaccine, right? So all the firms were sharing, their R&D teams were talking to each other, they were sharing all the DNA sequencing for the vaccine, which really cut down the time for a typical vaccine deployment would take at least 10 years, but we were able to make it happen in a year. So the same could be possible with the energy transition as well. And so, really look forward to working with you all and coming up with solutions that can really deliver a sustainable world.
And so I would say that for me, what is important is to find new end uses for hydrogen and create new demands, right? So that's why it was so interesting in the morning to see companies looking into hydrogen blending into natural gas, hydrogen turbines, or fuel switch hydrogen engines. That's the kind of project that we need to generate new demand for hydrogen, right? And if the demand is there, I'm pretty sure that the supply will catch up and projects will be easier to get approved and therefore jump-starting the economy, right? So I maybe because I am an equipment provider, we tend to be more involved on the supply side of the equation, but I'm always thinking with myself, where are the off-takers for all this hydrogen, right? And so it was very interesting to see this morning companies working on real projects and having real plans to find more uses for that hydrogen, because that will create the demand and that will just make it easier for more projects to be approved and implemented.
Yeah, so I agree wholeheartedly with Luis and Noureen's comments there. One of the other hurdles, I would say, or challenges that we see is all these projects, a lot of them in R&D phases, right? Each one's unique, right? So getting to scale quickly is very hard to do because, we're making a unique product every time. So, really finding, what areas in the market that could be standardized and, maybe some collaboration on, pressures and there's a lot of that going on in the different standard committees. But really getting to from one-off construction, bespoke construction to mass production would be a big hurdle to overcome.
Okay. I think we have a little time for some questions from the audience if anyone wants to. All right, I'll go ahead. Hopefully I can do this. Maybe I can do it there. I'm not going to jump there. Where did I see the hand? Oh, thank you.
Thank you, great forum. You've spoken almost exclusively about public funding, but where are you seeing private funding and where in the value chain or is it showing up the most?
One of the requirements for these DOE regional hubs, for example, is there has to be a minimum 1-to-1 ratio for public to private funding. So it's not just the government funding the regional hubs, but we are seeing a lot of investments from the private sector as well in these hydrogen hubs. And it's there across the entire value chain, but I would say it's the most in the industrial hubs application where there's quite a lot of different stakeholders and infrastructure that's already there and the end users are there, so it reduces that risk of where do we have these off-takers, and also reduces the cost in terms of they don't have to worry so much about the storage and transportation aspect of that hydrogen value chain, where they're able to produce those hydrogen on-site and use it on-site.
I will add to that, there are I believe there are a lot of uncertainties on the IRA legislation, and that's kind of having a negative impact on this private funding to reach those projects. So if you think about clean hydrogen, so if you go one step further, how do you measure that clean hydrogen? What standard are you going to use? And from our risk evaluation, that's something that investors don't like. So I think we need to have the government helping us to clear those uncertainties and give more assurance to the market, how this clean hydrogen will be measured, how this tax credit is going to work. And as you have these uncertainties solved, you see more private money going into those projects. That's what I think.
So my question is related directly to what you're saying right there. So the current incentives driving the escalation of these hydrogen projects is very recently established and largely tied to the current administration. Given that administrations can change every 4 years, how can companies be assured of the long-term returns necessary to justify these huge investments?
Well, I think for one, the tax credits are available for 10 years as part of that. I mean, there's nothing set in stone. Things could be repealed, I guess. Noureen probably knows a little more about that, but just from the events I've been at, and whether it's the trucking industry or other events like this, I mean, the ESG, incentive or the ESG directives that companies have is real, and they're basically waiting to spend some of that money for this solution.
And like Patrick said, yes, these tax credits are available for 10 years, and anything could happen with a new administration. But the fact is that the companies have their own net zero goals, and there's quite a lot of investor pressure to be able to lower the carbon footprint. So even if the subsidies are not available, the companies will have to eventually get there to net zero, and therefore it will drive the investments and the transition to those lower carbon fuels. And some of the programs that the companies and some organizations within the public sector have is to lower that cost and be able to make these projects economically viable even without credits. So yeah, I mean, anything can happen, but then I think the direction and the momentum is there in terms of lowering the costs and to be able to sustain without these tax credits in the future.
Yeah, my question is a little simple. What are other thoughts about the change with the industry infrastructure? Has there been any thoughts or consideration about the percentage of increase in overhaul costs to replacing units and things like that, Chair? And, I guess the other backside to that question is, what would be the number one underlying factor to speed things up or speed up the process?
Go ahead, Patrick.
Okay, well, I think, just from our colleagues earlier today, the overhaul and converting of some existing assets to natural gas, from purely natural gas to blended with hydrogen on a small scale, right, is not too high, but as a larger scale would be much higher. Of course, infrastructure development on high pressure hydrogen is expensive. I mean, for 700 bars, about 10,000 psi. And that's not even the pressure on the compressor. The compressor is actually designed to go to 13,000 psi to store that. So they are specialty machines, and there is a fair amount of cost in maintaining and overhauling them. What we're seeing is mitigating that by taking proven existing technology and adding a lot of more digital smarts to it. So how do you get your equipment monitored online, remotely, using trending and soft alarms to prevent failures that would be more expensive.
Yeah, so just gonna elaborate on that, and so what I think is when we're having these discussions, we tend to focus on the equipment itself, right, on the compressor. But I think sometimes on these projects, the compressor is actually the easier part of the job, because we know what we have to do. We can size a new compressor, you can revamp the existing unit. If it goes above a certain percentage, you have to completely swap the compressor, but that's also understood. I think the main challenge is to how do you guarantee that constant hydrogen supply for your project and clean. If you ever took a look on a hydrogen production plant, there's a lot of equipment, and the electrolyzer itself, it's actually a small portion of the plant. You have a lot of electrical equipment, you have compression, you have coolers, piping, systems, all sorts of systems, and on top of that, you have to find reliable renewable energy source at a competitive cost. You have to find your water supply at a competitive cost. For water is probably not an issue, but you have to have that constant water supply. For your electrolyzer, you're gonna have to clean that water. So I think for projects, that's actually the big challenge, in doing all of that at a competitive cost. So I think I would go beyond the compressor, and I think that's the real challenge for these projects.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Yeah, you were mentioning earlier about how cost-sensitive projects are, and the use of your equipment. API 618, has specific requirements for the design of that equipment. Are you seeing a push, or maybe any momentum in not deviating necessarily from API itself, using it as a guideline, but maybe coming up with a quasi-API or we'll say a lower cost version of some of that to be able to satisfy those low cost needs? Because we're seeing projects that just get completely, they get shelved because the cost basis is too high. And if we can get the cost down, we've done some projects utilizing well-established equipment, high-quality equipment in the LNG sector that are, we'll say, quasi-API. They're not, we'll say, fully compliant. They have some deviations, but they're intended to be low cost, and delivery meets the project guidelines. And I'm just wanting to see if you guys are from the hydrogen standpoint, because most of the people doing those projects are investor driven in a lot of the cases. We need to get the cost down. So how are you guys addressing that?
Absolutely. I mean, the bulk of our business is, very API 618, but when it comes to this hydrogen space, there's, a lot of things that we can do to, maybe that doesn't adhere exactly. So for instance, discharge temperature, right? So API 618 calls for discharge temperatures limited to 275 degrees Fahrenheit. So that may require more stages of compression than if you were allowed to go higher. And this development in the materials we saw earlier today is all part of it, right? So we can push those temperatures higher, get the machine on fewer stages, and reduce the CapEx for the compressor that way.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and this is something that I talked a lot about internally. But one thing to keep in mind, so API 618 standard, it was created with a focus on reliability. So that's a lot of the things that are there because of that extra reliability that was necessary for the refinery operators. Some of those features, they are important for clean hydrogen production plants. So I think all of them, maybe not, but some of them for sure. So I think Patrick mentioned that earlier on the panel. So I think the challenge is to find what is necessary for that project and what is not. Cost is a major concern for sure, but reliability also it is. But I think we are on a point where we are going beyond API 618 and trying to adjust the solution to that particular client. And another fun fact, like if you work like on a compressor RFQ for a refinery 5 years ago, you would get a spec package with 100 specs. And today you get the same RFQ for these clean hydrogen production plants, they have 2-3 specs. And you go ask them, say, hey, what are the other specs? And they tell you, you provide me what works. So that's a big change, and that introduces an additional responsibility for us as OEMs, because we have more flexibility, but also we need to provide something that is reliable at a competitive cost. So So that's another change that came with the energy transition, right?
Absolutely. I mean, there's traditional energy companies, right? And what they've done is purposely not spun off, but segregated the hydrogen business so that, the very high level of engineering, which, provides very high reliability, but maybe more CapEx extensive that the projects can support. So they've completely put that into a separate category, and really just trying to figure out, working jointly with the OEMs, what is fit for purpose to meet those requirements.
A question for Patrick. You mentioned electro fuels. I think I see what you're getting at there, but can you help me out? What does an electro fuel molecule look like compared with kerosene?
Right, so you're basically recreating the chemistry of hydrocarbon, but using, just green molecules of hydrogen and, carbon captured CO2. So I'm not, I'm sure that not too well versed on the actual processes of how it's made, but that's the gist of it.
Okay, I think it's time to wrap up. I want to thank our panelists for taking part today. Can we have a round of applause for them?